In this module, we will overview Chapter 6, which will begin looking at resources utilized within the project. Now, resources need to be viewed broadly. Generally speaking, they will include materials, equipment, personnel, anything that is required in order to execute the project. Now, the examples we're going to be using in this particular unit tend to bias a little bit more towards personnel, but as you read the chapter, make sure you're keeping a holistic view in mind when we're considering the concept of resources. Before we begin looking at managing the resources, let's remind ourselves of how resource constraints will appear within the baseline plan of the project. Now, our primary tool for the baseline plan is the network diagram. And the network diagram implies resource constraints based on how it's generated. So if you look at this upper diagram, the one up here, it is assuming that we have sufficient equipment and sufficient personnel to be able to paint all three of these areas of the project simultaneously. That may be correct. If it is, this is a valid network diagram. However, that may not be correct. We may have limitations on painting equipment. We may have limitations on trained personnel capable of performing those painting tasks. If those constraints exist, it is our responsibility as the project manager to include that in the design of the network diagram. Back to this first bullet point up here, project delays occur when the resources aren't available. You can't do the activities on the network diagram if you don't have the resources required to actually execute them. And therefore, the network diagram has to be designed with those limitations in mind. So, at the other far extreme, we have the diagram down here at the lower end of the slide. Here, it is fully constrained in that we can only paint one area at a time, either due to equipment or due to personnel. That also could be valid, depending upon the actual resources you have available. Therefore, both of these network diagrams are correct and both are incorrect. It totally depends upon the actual resources that you have on the project. And your job as the project manager is to be certain that your network diagram is realistic to the resources you have. We need to ask ourselves, if there are limited resources on the project, how are we going to go about managing those? An initial step, as we've discussed, is to build that resource limit or resource constraint into the network diagram. But we have the ability to change the network diagram and rethink our plan to try to better utilize resources. And so if we need to take that step, how do we approach it? There are two big ways. These will be discussed in your text of Chapter 6. I'm going to overview them here. The first is called resource-leveled scheduling. The second is called resource-limited scheduling. So we have resource-leveled and resource-limited schedules. The difference between these two is what you allow to flex and what you allow not to flex, or what you require to be fixed. In resource leveling, you fix the duration of the project. The project must be concluded by the required end date. You then level resource utilization the best you can within that available duration, that available time for the project. You can take steps to try to minimize fluctuation, but often you won't be able to completely level resource utilization when the timing of the project is constrained. In resource limited scheduling, we look at it the other way around. We have limited resources and we can't bring more resources to bear on the project than what we have because we're limited. Therefore, if necessary, we are going to extend the duration of the project in order to be able to do the project within the limited resources that we have. And there may be a penalty or price to pay because of that. Often many contracts will have a clause that if you don't finish the project on time, there may be some type of a financial fine or a penalty for not completing the project on time. And so there's a cost to be had with this idea of resource limited scheduling, but perhaps it's simply required due to the limitations that are present on your project. So I've summarized this in the diagram here at the bottom. What is fixed and what is allowed to vary. And you'll notice that the resources are in different categories. For resource leveling, the resources can vary. If necessary, you will bring more resources in order to make sure that you get the project done by the required completion time. However, on resource limited, the resources are not allowed to vary. They are absolutely fixed, and therefore the completion time may move out. Now let's look at how we would implement these on an actual project. We have here a very simple example, an example that is within your textbook of Chapter 6, but it's a good example to be able to demonstrate the differences between these two techniques. So this is a painting example. We're doing a renovation on a facility, and we have to paint in total 5 rooms. So we're painting the first floor rooms, we're painting the basement rooms, we're painting the bedrooms, the stairs and hallway, and then the bathroom. And we have here in this crude diagram, this is not really an official network diagram because of the way it's laid out, but it tells us much the same information. We know that it's going to take 8 days to do the first floor rooms, and it's going to take 2 painters during those 8 days. So 2 painters for 8 days in order to do the first floor rooms. 1 painter for 4 days, 1 painter for 6 days, 1 for 4, and 1 for 2. So we have here in this diagram the flow of the project because we have the connection lines. So as currently laid out, the assumption is all of these can go on simultaneously. And so we will look at that. Then after the first floor rooms are done, these 2 can happen simultaneously. And when they're completed, the project is finished. Now, let's look at what this does to us from a resource point of view. So this is the network flow of activities. Now let's look at the resource utilization. This diagram corresponds to the network diagram shown on the prior slide. But this diagram is looking at the resource utilization of the baseline plan. So we're assuming the network diagram is the same as before. We haven't changed anything. And you'll notice in this diagram, we have the resource utilization demonstrated in bars. So here, the first task lasts for 8 days. Here's the days. So it lasts for 8 days, and we have 2 painters involved in that activity. We have the basement rooms acting 4 days, and the bedrooms acting 6 days, 1 painter on each one. This allows us to tally down each column, remembering that there's 2 painters on the first floor activity. So we have 4 painters involved days 1 through 4, but then the basement room ends. And so then we have 3 painters involved days 5 and 6, but then the bedrooms end. And we only have 2 painters involved days 7 and 8 until the first floor painting ends. At that point, due to the way the network diagram is shown, once the first floor rooms are finished, we can initiate painting in the stairs and hall and in the bathrooms, 1 painter each, lasting 4 days and 2 days. This gives us 2 painters involved, days 9 and 10, and only 1 painter involved, day 11 and 12. Now, the project is being finished in 12 days, which was the plan. Okay, the original plan was let's do this project in 12 days, which is why it was shown that way on the network diagram. However, we have very unlevel resource utilization. We have 4 painters, 3, 2, 1. So unless those painters have other things to do, other projects they can be assigned to, other activities, after day 4, we have 1 person doing nothing. After day 6, we have 2 people doing nothing. And then after day 10, we actually have the majority of our team, 3 of the 4 individuals, doing nothing. Typically, we still owe salaries and work to and compensation to those people because they're employed by our company unless they're on an hourly contract kind of thing. And so therefore, this is not always a very advantageous utilization plan because it's so unlevel. So now we're going to look at how we could modify this baseline plan using our 2 techniques in order to improve the resource utilization. The process of leveling resource utilization begins with understanding the critical path of the project and understanding the slack within the project. So we're going to go back to the network diagram now and quickly compute those things in order to be able to discuss the critical path of the project. Remember, the project begins on day 0 and it needs to end on day 12. So if we quickly run through the calculations for the network diagram, we have these activities starting on day 0. This one will end on day 8. This one will end on day 4. This one will end on day 6. Painting of the first floor rooms is a prerequisite to both painting the stairs and hall and painting the bathrooms. So therefore, the 8 days goes forward to both of those. Adding on the 4 days, this will end day 12, this will end day 10, and we end up finishing by day 12 as required. Now, doing the backwards calculations, these have to end. The latest possible finish for each one of those is day 12. If we subtract off, that means this one has to have a latest start of day 8, but this one would have a latest start of day 10. Both of those feed back, and we take the smaller of the 2. So this is going to be 8 there. Subtracting off 8 days, the latest start for that one is day 0. These don't have anything after them, the painting of the basement rooms and the painting of the bedrooms. So therefore we bring back the 12 and we bring back the 12. And so this would have to start no later than day 8. This would have to start no later than day 6. So now with this, we can compute the slack. And I will show the slack in green. I know the diagram's a little crowded. But remember, the slack is that difference between these terms. So here you have a slack of 0. Here you have a slack of 0. Here you have a slack of +2. Here you have a slack of +8. And here you have a slack of +6. So what this means is that at this time, this is our critical path. This guy right here, I'll kind of highlight these. These are the critical path items, okay, because they have slacks of 0. So painting of the first floor rooms and painting of the stairs and hall is our critical path of the project. Now keep this in mind as we move forward. We are now going to look at resource leveled utilization. Remember, in resource leveled utilization, we cannot extend the completion time of the project, so we still have to finish in 12 days. The goal here is to balance or level the resource utilization by removing, if necessary, positive slack within activities, but items with negative slack or no slack can't be touched because those are already limited. We can't do anything. If they have zero slack, then they already only barely get done by the completion of the project. Obviously, if we have negative slack, then we're not even finishing the project on time. But in this case, if you'll recall from the prior slide, we have two items that have zero slack. And I'll go ahead and mark those for you. We have, let me make this a bit larger so that it shows up. We have this guy right here, first floor rooms, and we have this guy right here, painting of the stairs and hall. Those two have zero slack. Since they have zero slack, there's nothing more we can do with them. They exactly finish by the completion of the project. So we're going to leave them alone. But we can adjust other items as needed in order to be able to limit our resource utilization. Now, the item that had the greatest positive slack was this one here. It had 8, if I recall correctly from the prior slide, a positive 8 in the area of positive slack. And what we're going to do is we're going to shift it. Since it does have such a large positive slack, we can shift it by 6 days in order to make it begin after completion of the bedrooms, and we are still not into negative slack. We've shifted it 6 days, but we have 8 days of positive slack. So in so doing, we have now limited the resources to only 3 during this area. Remember, before we had 4 painters involved, days 1, 2, 3, and 4, if you look back at that table within your book. But now, by shifting the basement rooms, we only require 3. If we follow on forward, we could consider shifting this here. It has a positive slack of 2 days. If we wanted to, we could shift it by 2 days, giving it 0 slack. But if we did that, what we would end up getting, we would have, if I can draw this here, let me use a different color, we would have 3 painters involved during all of these times. But then here, if we were to shift the bathroom, we would drop to 2, 2, and then jump to 2. So here is our question. Keep in mind that there's multiple choices here. This green solution, the solution right here with the green arrow by it, is if we move this over. If we shift painting of the bathroom over by 2 days. As shown, we have this answer. As shown, we have 3 painters involved dropping to 1 painter. Okay, so this is the current solution. And this is a valid solution, and this is what the textbook shows. However, if we shifted the bathroom over, we could have 3 painters, but then drop to 2 and go 2 painters across here and go down. So we would have to ask ourselves, which is better? Do we want to have 3 painters involved for 10 days and then only have 1 for the last 2 days? Or do we want 3 painters involved for 8 days, but then have 2 involved for the last 4 days? The blue and the green paths would both be considered resource-leveled solutions. They both still end by the 12th day. That's critical. They have to end by the 12th day. Both of them do a better job of balancing resource utilization than our original network diagram. As you can see, when you start doing resource leveling, there are multiple solutions and decisions that will have to be made by you, the manager, to determine which you believe is best for your organization and for your particular project. So to summarize the idea of resource limited scheduling, we are now going to enforce the fact that we do not have resources available at our leisure. We are told by upper management, or we're told by other forces that be, that we only have certain resources to bring to bear on the project and that we cannot request or ask for more. Now that will have consequences. As shown in this diagram, since the resources are being limited, we have to push down our utilization of resources. We simply don't have them. We have too few personnel. But what that will tend to always do is, as we push down the utilization of resources, we push out the completion time of the project. There's obviously still a certain amount of work that has to be done. And so now that we're shifting our mind to resource limited scheduling, we're going to have to think about how much will we have to extend the project in order to live within the resources that we have been given. And so that's the big question. How much will we have to extend it? We don't want to extend it any more than necessary to live within the available resources for the project. I've here duplicated the slide from just a few screens back so that we can get this back in mind before we do the resource limited scheduling. Resource limited scheduling will be accomplished by paying careful attention to the slack within the project. And so let me remind you of that slack. Here we have the network diagram. The green numbers represent the slack, so our critical path has 0 slack. We have +8 on painting of the basement rooms, +2 on painting of the bathrooms, and +6 on painting of the bedrooms. We also still have precedence rules, so that's important to keep in mind. These two activities, painting of the stairs and hall and painting of the bathrooms, still cannot occur until after painting of the first floor rooms. We're not changing that precedence relationship. So keep these numbers in mind as we move to the next chart where we're going to start doing our resource limited scheduling. Okay, we're going to do this in multiple steps. These diagrams are in your book. They might be just a little bit more clear in your book, but what we're going to do is start systematically removing positive slack. Positive slack means that we are finishing items earlier than we need to, and so we're going to start systematically removing positive slack to limit resource utilization. And when we run out of positive slack, then we're going to start systematically removing even more slack, and we may have to go negative in order to limit our resources. But we want to eliminate positive slack first. We don't want to go negative until we have to. So in the upper portion of this diagram, shown here, okay, is our original plan. Remember the numbers from the prior slide. We have 0 slack on these two items. They're the critical path. And then we have +2, +8, +6. This is still finishing by day 12. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to start systematically removing the positive slack. We're going to leave the first 2 items alone because they have no positive slack. The item that has a lot of positive slack is item basement rooms, which is +8. So what we're going to do is we're going to shift the basement rooms all the way over until we have completed the downstairs rooms, the first floor rooms. Okay. We are also going to shift the bedrooms, which have a +6, and we're going to shift them all the way over until completion of the first floor rooms. Now, why are we doing that? Remember, we're trying to, in this case, limit our resources to only 2 painters. Well, the first floor rooms, which are on the critical path, require 2 painters. So we're using our only 2 painters available on that critical path item for days 1 through 8. So everything needs to shift until after day 8. Now, in the process of shifting, you'll notice that since the bedrooms take 6 days and we can't start them until after day 8, we have now extended the duration of our project already by 2 days. So now we have 2 days of negative slack on the bedroom. And we still have a problem. You notice that we've done a good job here, 2 painters involved, all the way up until we get to day 9. As of day 9, 10, 11, 12, we are over our limit of 2 painters. So we still have to shift things further. We're taking this in steps. So again, let's summarize what we've done so far. We are eliminating positive slack to stay within our resource limit, in this case of 2 painters. So we've shifted everything over in order to maintain 2 painters for days 1 through 8, and now we'll move on to the next step. Based on the earlier diagram, we still have too many painters starting day 9. We need to have only 2 painters involved. So what we are now going to do is shift the 2 items with the greatest positive slack, and we're going to shift those over until starting day 13 in order to limit days 9, 10, 11, and 12 to only 2 painters. We need 1 painter in the hallway, and we need 1 painter on the bedrooms, which has negative slack at this point, so it's now on our critical path, so we don't want to shift it further. And therefore, we're going to shift the bathroom and the basement room. Now we have 2 painters all the way up to day 12, which is great. We've made progress. But in shifting the basement rooms, we shifted those, remember, from starting day 9 to starting day 13. We have now extended 2 additional days. So now we have negative slack involved on 3 of the items. And we still have a problem. You'll notice right here, if I can point this out, we still have these items right here being 3 painters involved. We can't have 3 painters involved. We have to have fewer than that. So what we need to do now is shift 1 more item. Well, the item that has the greatest positive slack, that is also the smallest item, is going to be the bathroom. Now, keep in mind, these here, yes, they have larger positive slack in the sense that they're not negative, but because of their duration, to shift them over would lead to more problems than good. So we're going to shift this smallest item that's only a 2-day item, and we're just going to shift it over a little tiny bit, okay, from days 13 and 14 to day 15 and 16. In so doing, we can actually balance the resources without extending the duration further. If we, however, had shifted this one, which is 4 days, we cause more problems than good in doing that shift. So we shift this over. I can kind of show that. What we're going to do is shift this guy right here over to this location. In so doing, we now have this as our final configuration, and you'll notice that we have, which is our original goal, and I'll mark this, we have 2, let me make that larger again, 2 painters involved throughout the entire project. That was our goal. But in order to only have 2 painters involved, to limit our resources to only 2, we had to extend the project by a total of 4 days, and you'll see that is now the 4 days of negative slack that are on the bathroom and the basement items. So, consequences. We are now going to finish this 12-day project in 16 days. That means we have extended the project considerably. I mean, a 4-day extension on a 12-day project, that's a 33% extension in the project duration. And that has consequences with it on our contract and with our customer satisfaction, but it allows us to live within the limited resources available to us on the project. Okay, this ends our summary of this chapter. As you read through the chapter, be paying attention to these techniques and steps. Resource leveling is nearly always required. How severely you have to level it will depend upon the situation that you're living within at the time. What's available to you at your company? Can you hire outside help? Could you hire consultants? Could you hire contractors to participate in order to not have to extend the duration of the overall project, or is that simply not an option? So these are techniques in your toolbox that can add to your capabilities as a project manager.